There's a question deep inside. Will you guide me through the night? Will you calm the storms of my life? All these walls are built to comfortable, and the world outside is loud. When the voice I trust is fear and doubt, I don't need your guidance now. All my walls and my defenses fall to the ground. When the warmth of your light shines all around, your love is better than all the world can give. Your love is better than all the world can give. Will you save me from this emptiness? Will you lead me into peace? Will you save me from this loneliness? Will you hold my fears release? All my walls and my defenses fall to the ground. When the warmth of your light shines all around.
Glad that you are here and joining us, whether you're here in person or maybe you're here in person but outside. Glad that you're here. Want to welcome you if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube as well. But if you're here in person, I want to invite you to stand as we begin this morning by singing together.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me all along my pilgrim journey, Lord. I want Jesus to walk with me.
In my trials, Lord, walk with me. In my trials, Lord, walk with me. When the shades of life are falling, Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me in my sorrows. Lord, walk with me in my sorrows. Lord, walk with me when my heart within is aching. Lord, I want Jesus to walk with me.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me all along my pilgrim journey, Lord. I want Jesus to walk with me.
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me all along my pilgrim journey, Lord. I want my Jesus to walk with me.
I want Jesus to walk with me. Thank y'all so much for being here this morning, for joining us. And we want to give you some space to kind of acknowledge the people around you. And I want to remind you, as we're kind of jumping into this morning, that we have an opportunity to be present with each other. And it might not mean that you are kind of looking directly at someone or having a conversation, but there's something about being together in a room that, if you allow it, can remind you that you're not alone. And this morning we want to give you some space to do that. So feel free to turn around, say hi to someone, and then we'll continue singing together.
place again. God, I'm begging, please again. I need you. Oh, I need you. I'm walking down these desert roads, water for my thirsty soul. I need you. Oh, I need you. Your loving kindness, like sweet, sweet honey on my lips, like the sound of a symphony to my ears, like holy water on my skin. Dead men walking, slave to fear, wanna know your heart's draw me near. I need you, God, I need you. So take me to the riverside, take me on the baptize. I need you, God, I need you. Your love and kindness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips, like the sound of a symphony in my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. I just want to know your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really helps it be the change. I just want to know your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really helps me be the change. I just want to know your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really helps me be the change. I just want to know your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really helps me be the change. Your love and kindness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips, like the sound of a symphony to my ears. It's like holy water, your love and kindness. It's like sweet, sweet honey on my lips, like the sound of a symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. It's like holy water on my skin. It's like holy water on my skin.
Good morning. You may all have a seat. My name is Blair, and I'm the family pastor here, so I work with our kids from birth all the way through high school. And this morning, I specifically want to talk to our parents, grandparents, volunteers, or anybody who is around teenagers. So there are two main times in our lives that our brains go through this huge growth moment. One is whenever we are younger, at the age of 2. And the next is during adolescence, around the age of 11. So, on the 23rd, we are going to be having a potting shed where we talk about the teenage brain. And I want to invite anyone who is part of a teenager's life to be in that session with us. We're going to be talking about ways we can improve connection, communication, the ways that we show up for teenagers. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a lot happening in the brain. There are literally neuropathways that are being destroyed during that time and recreating. There's all this stuff happening. There's this simple system that they've operated in that is turning into this way more complex system at that time. And I don't know if you know this, but nobody pulled them aside in 5th grade and told them that was going to happen. So they're kind of freaking out. And nobody had a secret meeting with parents either around 5th grade that said this is what's going to happen. And it's really hard for parents because one day their kid woke up and they're like, "Who are you? I loved you yesterday, but today's a little harder." And it is. This second growth time is hard. The toddler age is easy. They're not independent. There's so much they still need from you. But once they become teenagers and they're around your height, they can talk. They have a mind of their own. It gets a little more difficult. So if you are in a teenager's life and you are looking to connect in better ways, or maybe you are a parent of a child that you are entering that phase pretty soon, I want to invite you into that space. So it's the 23rd. There is a QR code on the screen that you can register. We'll have a light lunch there, and it's an hour from 11:30 to 12:30. And it's not just a lecture space, but it's a space to connect with other parents who are here at Watershed. They're going through the same things. So I hope that you will choose to join us. I know you have a million other places that you could be, and I promise you that I will do my best to make that hour meaningful and worth your time. So I want to invite you to that. Second thing I want to invite you into is a project that we're doing. So I'm going to invite Dana up. And Dana, our professional bookworm that's here, come on up, is actually a nonprofit leader here locally in Charlotte that is going to be telling you more about our justice project we're doing this month called Booktober. So I'm excited. I'm going to let her take it from here and share more.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thank you for having me today. Like Blair said, my name is Dana Powell. I am the operations manager at Promising Pages. I'm also Dan and Carla Barber's daughter over there, so if you haven't met them, they're really cool people. Go check them out. They're pretty okay. So I know that you guys have been talking about Booktoberfest for the past couple weeks, and we really appreciate y'all hosting a book drive for us. Right now, Charlotte has something called a book desert, and this is an area where there are about 60,000 students that have very few, if any, books in their home. And even the books that they have, or maybe the magazines that they have, may not be the appropriate reading material for, let's say, a first grader or a second grader. 60,000 students is a lot of kids. And we know the importance of book access. We know the importance of having home libraries. And we also know that books are very much a luxury. We don't want our parents to have to make the choice of putting food on the table or paying a light bill or buying books. We want our students to know that wonderful world and the excitement that comes with reading and the joy that can come from that. There are some really staggering statistics that I could get into. The biggest one that I always like to point out is right now, only 22% of students living in the book desert are on reading level at 3rd grade. That's 22%. And that means 80% of our students are not where they're supposed to be. And if students aren't reading on grade level by 3rd grade, they are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. So these are really crazy things that are happening to students that are 6, 7, 8 years old. We see that their lives are kind of being determined for them, and that's not okay. Especially, a lot of us have grown up with books. My mom took us to the library every chance she got. So to imagine a world without books, imagine a home without books is just mind-boggling to me. So what you guys are doing by collecting books is so important. What happens is we ask our community to collect gently used and like new books for us. They come back to our warehouse, we get them cleaned up, we sort them into different categories, and then we use over 200 different nonprofit organizations kind of as our extension of distribution. So we have programs of our own, as well as these nonprofit partners that will come pick up books for free and pass them to students living in the book desert. So it is so important to have books collected. It's going to take about 350,000 books per year in order to give every child in the book desert 25 books. So that is a lot of books. This past year we distributed 276,000, so we're definitely making our way, but we cannot do it without your help. So thank you for hosting this book drive for us. We do serve students birth through high school, but our biggest need is that pre-K through third grade level. We really want to make sure that we're tackling that crazy third grade statistic. So if you do have any questions, I will be here afterwards. I also handle all of our volunteerism, so I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But thank you so much for having me here and for really making a difference. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dana. Yeah, give her a nice round of applause. So a couple more things this morning. First of all, you guys got to be really proud, right? Like Dan, Carla, did you tell her to say all that stuff about you, or paid her well? So a couple more things that we want to make you aware of in terms of ways to get involved here at Watershed. We've been talking about this for the last couple of weekends. There's a whole platform that you now have at your fingertips that if you're interested in knowing what's happening this week or in the subsequent weeks here at Watershed, there's a place for you to do that. If you would sort of indulge me and pull out your phone for just a moment, get the QR reading thing. I don't even know what that thing's called. The QR thing that takes a picture of QRs, the QR codes, and take a picture of this and put it someplace where you can remember it. There's going to be more accessible ways for this to happen in the future, but this is probably this is the best place to always know what's getting ready to happen at Watershed. This is where everything from social blocks, which we've started launching over the last couple of weeks, to future initiatives by groups like Primetime or Kindred, things like Reclamation, Preface. All of this is going to live on a Watershed calendar of sorts. And in matter of fact, I was looking at it here just a few minutes ago. Yeah, there's like 5 things between now and next weekend that if you're interested, you can now be a part of. And if you live in a particular region of Charlotte, chances are at least a couple times a month there's going to be something near you. I know last week there was something at Old Mecklenburg Brewery on Sunday afternoon. There was something at Hodges Farm on Sunday afternoon, and then on Monday night in Fort Mill. So there's a constant attempt to empower our community, which means you, to not just participate in these things, but put things out there that you might want to include folks to attend with you or be a part of. Or create or facilitate. And it could be a couple of more people or it could be 20 people. That kind of just depends on the thing that you're inviting them into. The point is for us to find traction relationally and socially with each other this fall. There's more developmental type environments that are going to be coming in November and then also in January and February. For instance, we're going to be, our preface dates are and our reclamation dates have already been announced for November 8th. That starts on a Tuesday night. If you are interested in signing up for either one of those, you can actually go to the connection card on Sunday, or you can go to the Sunday News event, and there's a place on the Watershed app. If you go to the Sunday News panel, you can actually sign up for Preface there or some of these other events. If you're brand new, Preface is sort of this on-ramping experience that we spend about 3 or 4 weeks, a room of about 15 to 20 folks, and it's like, all right, what does it mean to be here, and how does my spiritual past dovetail with who we are as a community? So that's the calendar aspect, or the social space that allows you to engage relationships here. And then I want to just take a moment and just really kind of celebrate some things that have been happening in terms of our finances and our resources. If you recall, if you've been around for the last 3 or 4 months, during the summer, we started noticing a deficit that started to take place. That deficit has grown, just continued to grow just a little bit. And we're going to talk more about some really encouraging initiatives that are not only impactful to who we are as a community, but what that means for us in terms of how resources flow. Again, a couple of weeks, we're going to stand up and make more defined statements about that and kind of pull you into a really powerful narrative. Having said that, the last 2 weekends, several of you have responded with recurring giving. Right now, in the month of October, we're at the middle of the month, and we're already almost to our goal. 4 out of 5 households or families have said yes to recurring giving. If we can average about 5 families a month, the way that fuels our resources here, the way that it allows us to plan for initiatives, for the work that we're going to be doing in the months ahead or the years ahead, is just a really powerful way of setting up our staff and our leadership to be able to do that. And so we're already midway through October. We're 80% there. That's the good news. I wanted to also remind you that we didn't meet our goals in August and September. So our goal, 5 new families per month, that's 60 new families, new households for the year. We're at about 42, 43 right now for the year. So we're pretty much on pace, but we're a little bit behind. So if you're willing to be a part of that, the invitation is for folks to sign up for recurring giving, $100 or more a month. If we can average that every month, man, that really helps create sustainability and stability. There we go. As we move forward, you can give several ways here. You can either give by going to our website. Obviously, there's a QR code in front of you that you can access. There's also some of you who might work for an organization that does matching. And if that's something that you're interested in, you can reach out to me at matt@watershed.charlotte.com or scott@watershed.charlotte.com, and we can work through those sort of, I guess, hurdles if there are any. So good things happening there. And then finally, this is the last morning for this current series. Next week, we start a series that's about 5 weeks long entitled The Places We Go. And this series is something our staff and our teaching team, which you had the opportunity to meet last weekend, several of you, we've been sitting with this series idea for about 4 months. So it's something we really are excited to bring into the focus of our community. And it's being inspired by a book called The Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. And I wanted to mention that this morning because part of what would really help fuel your experience with the series is if you were to actually either go purchase the book and kind of read through it. But there's also, from what I understand, an HBO Max, literal HBO Max series that if you have HBO Max or you wanted to sign up for that for a month, Brene Brown actually does a version of the book throughout that. I think it's 4 or 5 sessions. It's really powerful. I've watched it a couple different times. And so that's a way of kind of getting a supplemental experience around the series that we're going to be doing. We're really looking forward to it. In fact, this is a little bit of a teaser for what that might look like. Thanks.
When you said you felt so happy you could die, I told myself that you were right for me. I felt so lonely in your company. But that was love and it's an ache I still remember. can get addicted to a certain kind of sadness. Like resignation to the end, always the end. So when we found out we could not make sense, but well, you said that we would still be friends. I'll admit that I was glad it was over. But you didn't have to cut me off, make out like it never happened and that we were nothing. Didn't even need your love, treat me like a stranger and I feel so wrong. You didn't have to stoop so low, have your friends collect your records and then change your number. Guess that I don't need that though, now you're just somebody that I used to know. Now you're just somebody that I used to know. Now you're just somebody that I used to know.
Now and then I think of all the times you screwed me over, but had me believing it was always something that I've done. And I don't want to live that way, reading into every word you say. You said that you could let it go, and I wouldn't catch you hung up on somebody that I used to know.
But you didn't have to cut me off, make it like it never happened and that we were nothing. That didn't ever need your love, treat me like a stranger and I feel so rough. You didn't have to stoop so low, have your friends collect your record and change your number. Guess that I don't need that now, now you're just somebody that I used to know. Somebody
That I used to know.
Somebody
That I used to know.
Somebody
I used to know.
Somebody
That I used to know.
that I used to know. That I used to know.
That I used to know.
Somebody.
I needed that bumper to be a little longer so then it wouldn't feel like I was following that, but that the bumper was. Nevertheless, we press forward. If you would open your Bibles, God, that shouldn't work. That shouldn't work. It's been a while since I've opened like that, and it still works. Some of you are confused right now. Some of you are panicking. Some of you are uncomfortable. I really am gonna read from the Bible. In part, little backstory. I've been wondering why people ask you to bring your Bible, open your Bible, ever since we discovered projectors and began to project the words of the Bible onto the screen. At that point, it just seemed like, all right, leave it at home, keep it safe. I know some people have more than one. So yes, the words are going to be on the screen. You don't need to open your app or pull out your. I don't think any of you have one. But I do want to kick things off. We're going to be in the book of Luke, chapter 10, starting in verse 25. It's kind of long, so I wanted to just sort of get it over with at the beginning, so that we didn't have to disrupt any kind of flow I may or may not get into. later. And I'm sorry if that sounds like disrespectful. So yeah, starting in verse 25, you are familiar with this story, whether you know it or not. Just then, a religion scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. Dun, dun, dun. Teacher, what do I need to do to get eternal life? He answered, he being Jesus. What's written in God's law? How do you interpret it? He said that you love the Lord your God with all of your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as you do yourself. Good answer, said Jesus. Do it and you'll live. Looking for a loophole, he asked, and just how would you define a neighbor? Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite, religious man, showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan, traveling the road, came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins, gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." So what do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? The one who treated him kindly, the religion scholar said. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." That's all I need that for. So what's a neighbor? This was a story that we all grew up with, and full disclosure, I actually think this is one that whatever context we grew up in probably mostly got right. You know, if the basic takeaway, if the basic idea is, the person who is different, the person who is other, showing kindness on someone who culturally, socially, consistently you would not necessarily expect them to show kindness to. It's a pretty basic message. I don't know, however, if, at least for me growing up, if it was super obvious or clear whether or not it answered the question, who is my neighbor? What is a neighbor? And I grew up, and this is going to make me sound older than I think I am. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm deluding myself. But I grew up in a neighborhood, that they talk about on television shows. Many of you probably never experienced this, where you could kind of just run around freely, scrape your knees, and then when it was time to go home, your mom would come out. And do you know anyone who can do the whistle thing with their fingers? I can't. I'm not going to demonstrate it, even if I could. That would be terrifying. But so she wouldn't know where we were all day. We didn't have tracking devices like kids have now, no cell phones. And so we'd just be, gallivanting about in the woods. And when we heard the whistle, we knew it was time to go home and get cleaned up. Beyond that experience, running around with Eric Hartle, Mitch Hartle, Matthew Merrill, these were my neighbor friends. Beyond that experience, a lot of what I learned about neighborhood-wise, was from television. Of course, we all know Fred. May he rest in peace. Fred Rogers. Please. The neighborhood of Sesame Street, Gordon, Maria, Mr. Hooper. As I got a little older, quite providentially, I would argue, I was in 4th grade when Hey Arnold came out. Hey Arnold himself was also in 4th grade, so that felt right. And I learned about neighborliness, hospitality, what it means to be part of a community, from that lovely, lovely show. To this day, I remember the lessons that I learned from the likes of Gerald, Eugene, Sid, Helga, Mr. Wynn, the teachers. Not so much Ruth. That's who Arnold was always pining after. I don't remember if that ever worked out for him. But the point is, these shows were formative for me. Sidebar, actually, just while I'm talking about Hey Arnold, I think it's on Hulu. You should make your kids watch it. It was ahead of its time when it came to just navigating the complexities of neighborliness, diversity, inclusion, things like that. Phenomenal show. I bought it on DVD a few years ago, and then we discovered streaming, and that proved to be a waste of money. But neighbors, it's an interesting concept. I think it's one we take for granted. The genesis of this series, the plan wasn't always to kind of harken back to this kind of pre-pandemic, perhaps, period in our lives where we had certain associations. You might have noticed that each message in this series, it was the blank you used to know. We've talked about the preacher, the pastor, the church, things like that. It ended up being a series kind of about what does it mean to be a spiritual community in the wake of everything that we've experienced, in part together, but also in isolation. Kind of a weird alone together sort of thing these last number of years. It was an invitation back into community, an invitation, but also an acknowledgement that things aren't going to go back the way they were. Some of that's good. The pandemic has pulled back the veil on some things that shouldn't be. And now we're actually struggling, resisting attempts to put them back the way they used to be, which isn't ideal. But then in many ways it peeled back the curtain, peeled back the veil on so many things relationally that perhaps needed to be shown a light upon, but it was painful to do so. And so this series has been sort of like a messy engagement around what re-engagement looks like. What is sustainable? What is meaningful? What is accessible? What does it look like to be together, even if in many ways we still feel alone together? But before that, the thinking was that we would do something about politics. Some of you just freaked out a little bit. We freaked out a little bit. In fact, it was our own hesitancy to find the appropriate words that sort of led us away from that and into what we ended up talking about. The thinking was not so much to have like a list of political issues to take like a hard like left, right, either or binary stand on, but what we wanted to name, and in something of an irony I think we ended up naming, was the tension so many of us feel when it comes to relationships that once seemed fairly straightforward, but due to not merely the pandemic, but so many other things upon which the veil was lifted, and now we see each other a little bit more clearly. So many relationships that once seemed relatively stable now seem untenable, now seem impossible to maintain. For some of us, these are family relationships that have been soured, marred, weakened, by political differences, by different responses to the pandemic, or simply by unrelated relational tension that was much easier to keep stuffed below the surface, but came spilling forth amidst the close proximity that so many of us, or isolation that so many of us were forced to endure for the last 2+ years. And so we wanted to name that tension, and I think in many ways, by sort of circumventing the political theme, we ended up talking about what I hope was exactly the thing we needed to talk about. What does it look like to be together again? Which ultimately is the question that the religious scholar was trying to trap Jesus with, which is, who is my neighbor? Now, I knew that I was going to be closing the series, and I've been wanting to talk about neighbors for like years now. Finally got a chance. But to both my pleasure and dismay, everyone else in the series kind of already said everything I wanted to say, and probably better. They're better storytellers than I am. So if by the end of the day you're like, I don't know what that guy was talking about, just go back, watch some of the other talks again, or for the first time if you missed any. They're great. Especially one metaphor I especially want to point back to. If you missed Sean's talk a few weeks ago, she introduced this idea of rather than thinking of our nation, thinking of our community as a melting pot, which is one of the kind of popular metaphors when it comes to describing with rose-colored glasses what America was meant to be. To think of it instead as more of like a salad or a potluck, even. Because the problem with a melting pot, and I'm just going to steal from Sean because this was a beautiful point. The problem with a melting pot is that it sort of, it creates a homogeny, a sameness. Everything sort of melts into one amorphous blob. It all becomes the same thing. There's a sort of colonization, a sort of appropriation that happens. Whereas With a potluck or a salad, like the pieces remain distinct. They work together to form some greater whole. There's a kind of collectivity to it, but you can still discern the individual contributions. Not much of a salad guy, much to my health's detriment, but I've been to potlucks before, and yes, you can, you don't just pour everything into one, jar of stew. People can kind of pick and choose as they need to, and I think it's a beautiful picture of what community, relationality, neighborliness could look like. And part of the reason I love it, and if you got to hang out with us last week, when all 6 of our teaching team quite overwhelmingly graced the stage together, and we attempted to have a conversation about what does it mean for us to be preachers and teachers here, you might have heard me say, and if not, you should go listen to it because it was lovely, you might have heard me make reference to what is, for me, kind of the lens through which I process everything, particularly Scripture. And for me, the word that I use is the word contradiction. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning. Shocker. I said that I only preach one sermon. It's all about contradiction. And if you are paying close enough attention, and I do not flatter myself to assume that you are paying that close of attention to me, but, maybe you're just paying that close of attention to all of us, to which I say thank you. But contradiction is my lens. The Bible nerdy word is my hermeneutic. It's the thing through which I kind of interpret not just Scripture, not just my relationship to God, my relationship to others, but really the world as such, kind of everything all together. And when I say contradiction, what I mean is a resistance to, I think, the innate human desire to close the loop, the very human need to have everything eventually sort of resolve cleanly in a kind of holistic way. So that might be, let's say you're watching a television show and it's one of those mystery box shows with all sorts of twists and turns that keep you guessing. The reason Reddit exists, a show like that, and then how unresolved you feel if some of these mysteries, some of these questions that were raised early in the earlier seasons of the show are left unresolved. Some of you probably still have a negative. You're triggered by polar bears because a certain show never resolved that particular mystery. If you know, you know. So contradiction, it's something that I think we are allergic to. We feel uncomfortable in the face of things that don't sync up, that don't synergize, that don't come together in a clean way. And we even make all sorts of kind of pithy turns of phrase, metaphors, to sort of name our discomfort. Has anyone ever tried to fit a square peg in a round hole? If so, or if you've used that turn of phrase, then you are all too familiar with the human discomfort with contradiction. And yet, my contention is that the Bible itself, sidebar on the Bible, you were probably raised, being promised, assured, convinced the Bible is itself without contradiction. I disagree. In my opinion, the entire point of the Bible is to peel back the layers of the contradictions, the fundamental contradictions at the heart of reality, at the heart of humanity, and because humanity is itself a reflection of God, at the heart of divinity. You see, I think it is the desire that we have to overcome, to disavow, to fill in contradiction that is it's a reflection of, it's a reflection of what I think some people think of as sin. And so my contention to you, and I promise this relates to neighbors, my contention to you is, in fact, the contradictions we experience, the prevalence, the inevitability of contradiction in our lives is not, in fact, some visual, some experiential representation of our sinfulness or our fallenness or our unworthiness in the face of a non-contradictory God, but rather it's these contradictions that are the manifestation, the representation of our divinity. the Spirit of God, the reflection of God within us, that is one and the same with what it means to be human. So every attempt that we make to snuff out the contradictions in our lives is in fact an attempt to make finite, to arrest, to pull down, to overcome the infinite divine Spirit that is at all times trying to burst out, come forth into the world. And the reason that that makes us so uncomfortable is because in doing so, it leaves us vulnerable, and we're going to come back to that vulnerability. But I kind of want to I want to get practical around this, because we said it was going to be a political series, and then it wasn't going to be a political series. But psych, it was always a political series, even though it was actually a community series. Because really, at the end of the day, what is community, if not politics? All politics ultimately is, before we, muddle it with parties and binaries and things like that. Politics is just the wrestling, the struggling over how to live together. How do we exist side by side in community as neighbors? There's a fun word. It's Latin, so it makes it sound like you're casting a Harry Potter spell. It's modus vivendi. You can say it out loud if you want. I'm not going to make you, because some of you are probably introverted, but you can mutter it under your breath right now. Modus vivendi. You can picture Hermione Granger saying it and then lambasting Ron Weasley for saying it wrong. Modus vivendi, it means way of life. Very simple. What it means, philosophically or conceptually, is it's an approach to political thinking that does not seek to resolve or overcome the tension between two disparate positions, but finds a way to hold the tension together. And historically, this idea of modus vivendi has been associated with Christianity, because the early aughts of the Christian faith were very scandalously and very confusingly, to those on the outside looking in, associated with this kind of tension holding, this kind of not reconciling the contradictions amongst the various faiths and peoples and cultures and ethnicities of the world around during its inception 2,000 years ago, but this kind of weird tension holding. And much of the New Testament is about this. We see Paul wrestling with holding the tension of what does it mean? What does it mean that this Jesus is in many ways the fulfillment in Paul's eyes of the very Jewish kind of hope and faith, and yet there's this invitation, this universal invitation to know God through the very contradictory life of Jesus. But does that mean that those outside of the Jewish faith, outside of the Jewish culture, outside of the Jewish ethnicity, do they need to then become Jewish? And there were some very painful ways for at least men to do that. Or, some of you know your Bibles, as Paul ultimately concluded, do we kind of just both and this thing? Yes, there's this Jewish element, and yes, there's this Gentile element, and they can be together, and yet, using our potluck metaphor, distinct. They are both one, and yet remain diverse. And Paul was insistent that on some level, this is what it meant to identify with the person of Christ, this modus vivendi, holding the tension. Because if we think about most of our political approaches, and I would argue, if you're uncomfortable with the political example, most of our relational approaches are, even when well-intentioned, they don't like contradiction. Perhaps some of you are familiar with political persuasions that are constantly looking back, constantly remembering, seeking to, conserve something that supposedly once was. If only we could get back to there, everything will be good again, or great again. Everything will be whole again. Everything will be non-contradictory again. If we can just go back and put everything, or everyone, in its proper place. It's usually a hierarchical place, but then everything will be good again. But not to merely pile on to those who long for that kind of wholeness, There are those who see the answer to contradiction in progress. I think you can follow who this group is. You might hear them talking about, well, if we can just get everyone to the right side of history, which ironically would be the left side of history, but if we can just get everyone over here, then all of us together will be whole. And while everyone is invited, if by some chance some of you don't come along, well, we're actually 100% okay with that because we don't like you anyway. And then there are those who maybe stand in the middle, and they're like, you're both wrong. We need balance. The way to overcome contradiction is to have a little bit of both, kind of this middle way, this third way. Let's be more, moderate in our assumptions. But in all three instances, and again, if you're uncomfortable with the political analogy, because we're at church and you've probably told that we're not supposed to talk about these things, relationally it's the same thing. Who's been in a relationship where contradictions are arising and maybe one person's like, if we could just go back to the way things were at the beginning, if we could just go back to, remember when, and nostalgia creeps in, remembering that, there was, and by the way, again, it's usually misremembering, that, everything was perfect back then. Or, if we could just get to this other place, take this class, go to this therapy session, read this book, then if we could just get over here and then, maybe it's balance. And sidebar timeout, I'm not saying that there's not value sometimes in all of those things, okay? So don't hear this as me saying, like, don't go to therapy or don't read that book. You should totally do those things. But it's this assumption, which I'm going to identify with idolatry, this assumption that if fill in the blank, we can fill in the blank, then we will finally overcome the contradictions of our existence. And what I want to suggest to you is that it is not the overcoming of contradiction that brings us closer to the divine. And if I say divine, anytime I say divine, you can just know that I mean something synonymous with the human, with the authentic, with the free. So it is not the overcoming of contradiction that brings us both closer to God and closer to our true and authentic humanity, but rather it is the embrace of contradiction, the making peace with it, to again go back to our potluck analogy, to making peace, to being with the other as other, and not asking the other to become anything other than what they always already were. Now, that doesn't mean we don't grow, that doesn't mean we don't change, doesn't mean we don't evolve, but we don't attempt to objectify. You all know what that word means. You have Instagram. To objectify is to reduce, and often you think you're elevating. It's a reduction. It might feel like an elevation, but it's to take something and turn it into an object, something that you can assimilate, something that you can own, something that you can conquer. To subjectify is to leave the contradiction intact, to leave the split, the cut, and the cut is uncomfortable. It makes us feel vulnerable. But the gift, the secrets, the truth of neighborliness is that it is, in fact, the one thing that we all end up having in common, that vulnerability. Because it's all of us together, despite our particularities, despite our differences, despite our fears, and the way that we attempt to overcome those fears in ways that both hurt us and hurt others, that all of us are these messy mixtures of the infinite and the finite, the human and the divine, with the infinite and divine parts of us constantly looking to burst forth in infinite ways. You wonder why we are so diverse. How could you ever consolidate the infinite? Of course we're going to be constantly changing, evolving, reinventing ourselves, and the experience of that is going to feel uncomfortable and vulnerable at times. So to be a neighbor is to embrace that. And to remember that it is precisely that collective vulnerability, that messy bursting forth of God within us, and within you, within the other, all of us together, is in fact the thing holding us together. So I think that's my big idea here is to be a neighbor is to be in a contradictory community. It's kind of, I don't know if it's the opposite. It's different from a tribe. A tribe is held together by sameness. A tribe is held together by common cause, common experience, common belief, common background. And sure, you can share those things with your neighbors, and that's fine. Sometimes you might be a little closer to the neighbors where you do, but my kids are blessed to be in a neighborhood very similar to the one that I grew up with, which I'm told you don't see much these days. We've got some close family friends with kids of a similar age, and they run around together, and it's a small neighborhood, not a lot of traffic, so we've grown fairly comfortable kind of just letting them run freely as long as we know where they are, as long as they don't go past a certain point. But even with these neighbors, these friends, really, who we've grown quite close to, there's still an otherness about them. We might align politically, we might align socially, but, they parent differently. They spend their money differently, prioritizing different things. There is still an off-putting otherness that we have to reckon with and wrestle with to be neighbors. Even amongst the like-minded, there is no assimilation, there is no reduction of the other to me. So a neighborhood is different than a tribe. It's holding the tension. It's being with and being for without being as. And that's an important distinction. In fact, perhaps God's original act of creation was an effort to be with and to be for without being as. God wanted there to be an other, because it's only when there is an other that you can experience beautiful things like love. This won't shock a few of you. I want to close with an analogy from The Lord of the Rings. I just finished Rings of Power. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I do know who Sauron is. No, I want to go back to the original trilogy. The statute of limitations on spoilers has long since passed that, so I'm on safer ground there. And my favorite of the original films, not so much the original books, but my favorite of the original films is The Two Towers. And near the end of The Two Towers, for those of you unfamiliar with this masterpiece, the heroes, Aragorn, heir to the throne of Gondor, Theoden, king of Rohan, the horse masters, they're holed up in what is called Helm's Deep. It's a fortress, and the forces of evil have laid siege to them. They're about to lose. Theoden's losing hope. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase, how does one stand against such reckless hate? And Aragorn says something very contradictory. He says, ride out with me and face it head on. And so in what in the moment seems like, a self-destructive choice that's going to lead to their doom, they even say to death, to ruin, they ride out. And they ride out, and at the last moment, Aragorn recalls something that the wizard Gandalf had told him like 5 days prior. He said, on the morning of the fifth day, look to the east. And he looks up, I don't know if that's east, but he looks up, and on top of this hill, as the sun's coming up, there's Aragorn, and then King Theoden's nephew, Éomer, who he had exiled, is back. And Gandalf looks down upon, the very few, quote-unquote, good guys fighting against the hordes, the legions of the bad guys, and he says, Theoden, king, stands alone. And in a moment that I'm not going to be able to do justice to, but you should trust me and go watch it, because it's so epic. Éomer rides up and he says, not alone. And then the music does this cool music thing, and they all charge, and they win. What does that have to do with being a neighbor? There is something contradictory about the idea of riding out, knowing that it's not going to resolve the contradiction, knowing that it's not going to It's not going to bring things to a clean, comfortable conclusion. And what Theoden learns in that moment is there are forces, powers, things at work beyond his purview. He went out not blindly, some might call it faith. He went out assuming, not knowing how things were going to resolve, completely unaware that there were things at work that were going to bring things to a head, ultimately for his good, not in a way that any way resolves the contradiction, but in a way that is generative. It brings forth something new. In this moment, there's a kind of death and resurrection experience. Theoden had to die to a certain kind of expectation, a certain assumption or belief about how the contradiction would be resolved, so that he would be open, vulnerable to the new thing, the resurrection thing that was going to be created in the wake of that choice. So when it comes to what does it mean to be a neighbor these days, yeah, I know that there are people in your lives who, because of their beliefs, because of their actions, being honest, they might not be safe anymore. Don't hear this as any kind of diatribe against boundaries, against reparation, against harm reduction. This is complex stuff, y'all. It's messy. So perhaps not literally, but at times symbolically, metaphorically, maybe there's a wisdom to writing out in the face of the contradiction, knowing it cannot be, knowing it must not be resolved. The same mentality as King Theoden, to death, to ruin, trusting that the shape of Jesus' own life, a life of death and resurrection, is in fact a reflection, just as we are, of the very contradictory nature of reality. The divine and the human held in tension, not in beautiful synthesis, not in beautiful symmetry, but in beautiful contradiction. What it means to be a neighbor is going to look different for each of us. I don't know the tensions latent in your friendships, in your relationships, in your family struggles, in the bridges that have perhaps been burned in the last 5 years. It is for you to determine what healthy boundaries are, where you need to draw lines, where you need to extend olive branches. But my exhortation, my encouragement, my promise, what I think is the promise of this community, all of us together, is that if and when you choose to ride out, not knowing how things are going to play out, if and when you choose to, with vulnerability, embrace the contradictions in your relationships, in your life, the core of your very being, that in the midst of that, you'll look up, you'll look around, you'll look at the people in this room, and just like with Theoden King, you'll hear, not alone. Thanks for being here this morning. Really excited about this next series, so please come back and hang out with us in the coming weeks. Have a good Sunday.
Would you stand as we close this morning and sing together? At the right time, when I least expect it, never behind. So why would I be surprised when you deliver every time? On mountain tops, you stay.
On mountain tops, you stay the same. In valleys low, you never change. And I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. I'm confident as seasons change, your faithfulness remains.
God of my present, the God of my future, you write my story, you hold it all together. God of my present, God of my future, you write my story, you hold it all together. God of my present, God of my future, you write my story, you hold it all together. God of my present, God of my future, you write my story, you hold it all together. And I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. And I'm confident as seasons change, your faithfulness remains. Sing, I believe. And I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. I'm confident as seasons change, your faithfulness remains. Oh, your faithfulness remains. Your faithfulness remains. And I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. I'm confident as seasons change, your faithfulness remains. Sometimes this idea of God's faithfulness comes across in something that is disembodied. This God that's out there. And so sometimes that feels distant. When we go through pain, we go through hardships in life, we ask this question, where is God? I want to maybe kind of echo some of what David said. And maybe God shows up in the collective, in the neighbor, in the community. So I want to ask you to sing this one more time, maybe just with that lens. And I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. I'm confident as seasons change, your faithfulness remains. Your faithfulness, your faithfulness remains. God, we thank you for the space in which we can be reminded of your faithfulness, your love.
And not just in this disembodied space, this space where it shows up out of nowhere, but God, in the everydayness of life, in the coffee appointment with a friend, in the smile from a stranger. God, we see your faithfulness. And so, God, may we not just receive that throughout our week, but may we also embody it. May we also embody your faithfulness to others, your love, your grace, your peace, that the world would be changed. God, we thank you, we love you, and we pray all this in your name. Amen. Have a great week. We will see you next Sunday.